In my last video, I began looking at the book, The Lonely American, Drifting Apart in the 21st Century, published by psychiatrists Jacqueline Olds, MD, and Richard Schwartz, MD. I focused especially on their discussion of how the lonely and socially isolated individual can easily end up being diagnosed with a pathological condition. This is exemplified by the following passage. Page 159, to quickly paraphrase, social disconnection leads the individual to fear the following. Is there something wrong with me? That fear builds in solitude, and the individual finally ends up in a professional's office. Once he or she is there, the fear will almost certainly be approached from the perspective of individual pathology, preferably with a clear diagnostic label, despite all the evidence that increasing social isolation is a societal problem. Writing as psychiatrists, they might as well write plainly. If you come to our offices or the offices of other mental health professionals thinking something is wrong with you, we will affirm that view, giving you a diagnosis, labeling you as being mentally ill, even if you are simply dealing with loneliness and social isolation. Even if the medical model of mental illness were accurate, this would still be the equivalent of diagnosing a mildly torn muscle as a major bone fracture and subsequently treating the limb in question with invasive surgery and internal fixation or pins, or otherwise causing unnecessary mobility issues and overall disruptions to quality of life. Although psychiatrists or advocates for the mental health industry never say as much, at least in works such as the one in question or the prior book I covered by Cacioppo and Patrick, mental health interventions are just as invasive, and they are not without their negative side effects. But this is the general problem with the mental health industry. Every human problem must be filtered through the lens of pathology. No human condition can be a simple, normal human reaction to life and its context. To move on, however, Olds and Schwartz address the societal problem of social isolation, concluding with the following. Page 193, removing any attempts at flowery explanations. The story we have to tell about American loneliness is ultimately a story about the pursuit of happiness, a search for a little respite and dignity in a frenetic world. Loneliness is not the goal. It's just the spot where too many people wind up. The solution to the problem of social disconnection in America is not to eradicate moments of solitude in people's lives. The solution is not even to eliminate moments of loneliness in people's lives. They are part of the human condition. A part of the normal human condition, still subject to pathological interpretations and subsequent interventions by the likes of the authors. There are times in all of our lives when we each need a little loneliness. There are times when loneliness has something important to teach us. Without it, how can we cherish our attachments and pay our respects to the ones that we lose? It comes down to a question of balance. The problem is that the authors cannot recognize what balance is when it comes to humans and their relationships with others. Throughout their book, Olds and Schwartz identify individualism and self-reliance as the cultural values at the heart of the societal problem of loneliness. Now, the authors start addressing individualism in their opening chapter, but I wanted to save that for last. Discussing self-reliance, however, the authors write. Page 35. Self-reliance is a virtue. It's just a complicated virtue. When treated as a sufficient goal in itself, it can lead to a life, a country, and a planet out of balance. Small choices at the margins of busy lives accumulate and result in people feeling left out, ashamed, and sometimes very angry. The authors especially call out the ideal of the outsider who stands apart yet shapes our country's destiny, with the emphasis on apartness rather than self-sufficiency. To address this and other issues, the authors offer a hodgepodge of examples. For instance, the authors latch onto the film industry and characters played by Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, juxtaposing it with Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac and the work of Robert Bellah, criticizing Protestant culture and its near-exclusive focus on the relationship between Jesus and the individual. Olds and Schwartz are all over the place, even if some of their individual criticisms are well placed. Take the following passage, for example. Page 37. Rio Bravo, a 1959 Western in which John Wayne, Dean Martin, and Ricky Nelson take a brave and lonely stand, is particularly interesting because it was an explicit effort to correct earlier myths. In a 1962 interview with Peter Bogdanovich, the director, Howard Hawks, explained how he came to make the movie. It started with some scenes in a picture called High Noon, in which Gary Cooper ran around trying to get help and no one would give him any. And that's rather a silly thing for a man to do, especially since at the end of the picture, he is able to do the job by himself. Or as Hawks put it in a later interview, I didn't think a good sheriff was going to go running around town like a chicken with his head off, asking for help. Most of us remember Gary Cooper in High Noon as a brave man standing alone. Hawks tells us that even he was not self-reliant enough to be a real American hero. He looked for help. The obvious reality is that the Western film is a Hollywood construction that does not even reach the level of historical fiction. Perhaps you could call it American mythology. But as the authors later pull in the case of both Rio Bravo and High Noon, the supposed mythical loner outsider is not so outside and consistently needs help. But this is fiction, this is fantasy, as the authors adequately address. But they then start to follow an odd line of thought along with their discussion of the American frontier. Page 39. The American frontier has also given us feminine versions of self-reliance and apartness, like Laura Ingalls Wilder's classic stories, Little House in the Big Woods and Little House on the Prairie. The titles themselves evoke our pioneers' isolation in the vast, uncivilized spaces of the frontier. They also suggest how the feminine ideal differs from the masculine one. The frontiersman is alone, surrounded by nature. The frontierswoman is at the hearth, holding together a family, which is itself alone, surrounded by nature. Notice the language here. The family is alone. The family is self-reliant. Page 51. But the outsiders weren't really outside. No one really made it alone, not even on the frontier. The authors had originally called the classic American hero a not-quite outsider. We were trying to evoke an image of someone who stood at the far edge of a community, but not completely outside it. Not quite outsider was just too clumsy to conjure up much of anything for most people. But it remains a more precise description of the ideal than the word outsider. Life on the frontier was a complex mix of self-reliance and inescapable interdependence. John McFarriger, a historian who wrote about frontier life, described self-sufficiency as a community experience, not something achieved by individuals or separate families. Cabin raisings, log rollings, hayings, huskings, harvestings, or threshings were all traditionally communal affairs. Farm families depended upon their neighbors to supply the variety of goods and tools and the extra supplies of labor that made economic life possible. Notice how the family is viewed exclusively as a single unit, never itself as a group of individuals, say, two interdependent adults with dependent children. It would certainly seem as if interdependence can only happen at the larger community level, and it is almost as if the family unit itself is negligible to the authors. Page 47. A healthy community, whether it appreciates the fact or not, needs both the bonds of loyalty and the willingness to risk isolation and loneliness in the name of a greater good. Here, the obvious implication is that the individual is just supposed to submit himself or herself to the greater community. This also matches the worldview implicit in Cacioppo and Patrick's book, Loneliness, and how the lonely individual should fall in line with the needs of the group, fixing themselves or seeking out help from the mental health industry because his or her behavior as a result of loneliness may bother other people, and the social cohesion of the group must come first. In this context, Olds and Schwartz also make an odd comment. Page 131. Marriage may be greedy, but it is also generative in ways that create engagement in larger communities. It is as if, to the authors, every relationship or interaction should be filtered through the question, does it benefit the greater community? And here it is important to take a step back to the author's introductory chapter and their perspective on individualism. Page 8. The starting point for almost every contemporary examination of disconnection in America is Alex de Tocqueville's 1835 observation that the United States had struck a dynamic balance between individualism and community. The country was thriving, but Tocqueville feared for its future. Here the authors quote directly from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Individualism, a calm, considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. They form the habit of thinking of themselves in isolation and imagine that their whole destiny is in their hands. Finally, each man is forever thrown back on himself, and there is the danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. Here the authors present this as a critique of overexuberant individualism. Withdrawing into your circle of family and friends, to make it clear, is viewed as overexuberant individualism. In a world in which the individual is so easily atomized, separated off from intimate relationships and any sense of close community, and is expected to, even as Cacioppo and Patrick suggest, fix themselves in relation to the problem of loneliness. This is a disturbing worldview. Having the option to withdraw into your own circle of family and friends, leaving the chaos of the greater society to its own devices, if you will, is exactly what so many of us need. It also says a lot about how we have devolved as a culture, if this was how the outsider viewed the problems of America in 1835. But beyond their perverted perspective of humanity as psychiatrists, Olds and Schwartz also out themselves in the opening pages of their book as to the origins of their further skewed worldview. Or as they state later, that the individual should give to society, page 47, both the bonds of loyalty and the willingness to risk isolation and loneliness in the name of a greater good. The authors note that they quote Alexis de Tocqueville a bit nervously. A reviewer in the New York Times recently warned readers away from any book that starts with Tocqueville. And I will leave it off here until next time, picking up on the topic of loyalty to society. I hope to see you there.